there any limitations to non-dualism? And if so, what are they and how can they be overcome?
The only limitation to non-dualism is the self.
Well, that's true. I guess I'm thinking that the limitation may be that people approach it thinking that it's really stripped so bare. I mean, it's direct, but it's also rich. And the only thing it's missing is, a tradition or a community or a...
Yes,
I mean,
it's not a point of identification.
Yeah, non-dualism, yes. And it's just, look at, how we can, from the point of view of non-dualism, appreciate other spiritualities. The nice thing about the direct path is that it gets you closer to the essence, and you may be less hung up on forms, but it's nice to be able to see manifestations of it in the world.
Yes, similarly, I think one of the limitations of non-dualism is that it essentially doesn't have a form.
Yeah, and it's more like a philosophy than a practice. The direct path, that's more of a practice.
It's more of a practice than a philosophy, yes. Yes, so therefore one of the limitations of the term non-dualism is that it doesn't answer the question of what to practice. And it seems like a philosophy.
Yes, but I think one can, you can start there. Greg has things to practice.
Oh, this is the direct path, which has no philosophy, yes, of course.
It what?
It has no metaphysic.
Well, yeah, it needs none, but people might need some on the way.
That's what we're discussing here, right?
But in principle, there's no limitations if non-dualism means the direct path. But in practice, there may be limitations.
Right. It also can be a little hard to grasp without some sense of it or exposure to it.
Yeah. I mean, of course. It's direct. You're not going to get it just from the name.
Yes, that's right.
I always smile because what you said about it being direct is so right. And often I wonder if non-dualism becomes some sort of an identification also for people who associate just being non-dual without a practice and a form.
Yeah, I mean, to the extent we are doers, there's always the question of what to do.
Right.
But you can kind of leave that up to whoever is presenting the teaching. And there should be a sort of a natural harmony that forms between teachers and students. Because every path is not for everybody.
Agreed, completely. And a point always worth making.
Yeah.
But there is a path for everybody.
Yes, if they want it.
Right. How are we doing? Would you like to contribute to this question?
Good, but I would say it's not so much non-dualism as such that has the limitations, but how certain people portray non-dualism, because there are almost as many non-dualisms as there are teachers of non-duality. So just as there is Christianity and there are many sects of Christianity, you have within non-dualism a lot of metaphysical disputations. But one thing I would say that is a limitation of most forms of non-dualism that I've seen is that the teachers tend to focus too much on being versus becoming. And I think it's very important to have a proper degree of emphasis on the realm of becoming, because in the here and now, that is what we are. We are in a constant state of flux and becoming. We are being towards the divine, towards God. And it's just something I think is an emphasis that oftentimes is lacking. And it rigidifies things and makes them static, if that makes any sense.
Well, I see your point. I think on the other hand, so much of non-dualism is about there isn't any becoming, because there isn't any future. There isn't anything to grow toward. If it isn't here now, it isn't at all. So the becoming is becoming what we are now. not placing ourselves in some future role where we are somehow better or wiser. And I agree with you, Sade, it's a two-edged sword.
Yes.
Yeah, in many ways, we are becoming.
All right, I think you nailed it. Good.
And that's something that I'm not going to dwell on too much. Siddhi Talha pretty much hit the nail on the head, but it's, you know, what you said also, Sheha Bashir, it's a very valid criticism of the standard notion of becoming. And I tend to think of things in terms of the Heraclitean flux. And Heraclitus was one of the greatest philosophers of all time. He was a mystic, he was a practitioner. Sadly, we don't have much of his stuff left, but essentially for him, we are being becoming. And it really pushes the boundaries of language.
He was the Cantareya, was that right?
Yes.
All is flux.
Yes.
All is becoming.
Yes.
Yes, don't forget that becoming implies some kind of change, and that only happens in time.
And it only happens now, yes.
Yeah, but it is now.
Yes, it is.
But it can't happen. It can't be an event without having time involved.
Yes. Yes.
But, if this is our lived experience, that there is becoming, I don't mean to belittle it by any means. I think the direct path, and for that matter, Advaita, tend to want to not deny becoming, but say, that look more deeply.
All right. Next question. In terms of the practices, is there anything you think the Tariqa is lacking? And if so, what is it? And if it is part of another tradition, how may we adopt it?
Well, there's nothing missing in our Tariqa, and by that I mean the universal order of non-dual oneness. But in my almost 50 years experience in Tariqa, yes, I think there's something that's desperately missing in it, and that is method and personal guidance. And for a long time, I thought lectures in philosophy were personal guidance, but they're not.
Right.
So, but I think, alhamdulillah, we have been able to add from other sources, some Sufis, some others, enough content and substance to our daily lives in the Tariqa that it has overcome the limitation of being a philosophy club.
I think we've moved far away.
We've moved far away from that.
Right. Well, of course, the Tariqa was never supposed to be that.
No.
It just turned out to be too much like that.
Yes, and it turned out to be too much a platform for personal egos affirming their worth and condemning those who didn't meet a certain model.
Yeah. Well, once again, it gets back to the only limitation is self.
Yes. But let's examine this question a little more closely, because are there things that we are lacking, and are they available from other Sufi orders or from other spiritual traditions, or for that matter, from other non-spiritual traditions, or let's say not directly spiritual traditions?
We could do better with young service.
Yes, I agree with you completely.
There's so much transformation that happens, and service is a very common practice in any spiritual order, be it Sufi or not. And it just opens up, I think we touched on this last time, but it opens up the possibility of indirect inquiry that happens during serving. There's something special about that. So I feel we could do better as far as service is concerned.
Yeah, service is a concrete experience of giving up some of yourself.
Yes, giving up some of yourself, indeed, for God.
Yeah. For God, for your neighbor.
And to get free of yourself, after all.
Well, yeah. If you clutch it too tightly, you'll never be free of it.
That's right. So then the question becomes, how do we do that? I mean, there's some spiritual orders where everybody is mandated to pay a percent of their income and spend a portion of their time in service to the group. That doesn't sound like us.
It could be writing a newsletter.
Yeah, it could be anything, and all of these things are valuable not only to the order but to the individual. The question is, how do you incorporate them, or how do you make them part of a system or a community?
Have any of you been to the Bawa Muhayyiddin Masjid in Philadelphia?
Yes, I have. It's amazing.
It's amazing, yes. And that there is service. Yeah.
And I was fortunate enough participating in that service, and it felt like family. It felt that we've known each other for such a long time. And I think that's what service does, because without being aware of ourselves, it's actually shedding some of ourselves in the process. And so it gives the opportunity to see oneself as a part of a universal consciousness, as opposed to a separate being.
And can help us see the nature of ourself by seeing it in others.
Yes, well said.
And going along with this, I think one thing that is lacking in the Tariqa is heart. I think we need to get out of the head and have some heart. And since we're talking about Philadelphia, maybe we can learn from the Rocky Balboa Center for Sufism of the Heart. But seriously speaking, I think we need more heart. And, you know, Sheikh al-Bashir, when you recite poems, or when you a couple of times have mentioned Odysseus and his path towards home, you could feel the emotion there. You could feel the heart in what you were saying, which is something that for all of my time in the Tariqa with almost everyone else you don't have. You have such rationality, such lack of depth of feeling that puts everything in the head without it being in the heart, and that's bad. I think this needs to be fixed.
I think everybody in this conversation, and I think pretty much everybody I know in the Tariqa, would be quick to agree with you. The question is, what do we do now?
I think we need to talk about it in our gatherings. That would be the first thing.
Well, it certainly arises from greater contact among the individuals. And I've always been an advocate of this fuqara, seeing each other outside of the majlis and outside of the rites, to talk about the course of life as human beings. And the more interaction there is, the more openness, and I assume caring and compassion, will arise. But how do we do this?
The first thing I would go back to whenever we meet, for example.
Yes, but we still need to have something concrete to do.
You know, I'll just throw something out there that, and this is not from religious orders. Yes, Bawa Muhayyiddin's mosque, they do it, but also a lot of anarchist communes do it, and they get people to come together and cook together. And, you know, when you have a bunch of people coming together and cooking things, they tend to talk and get to know one another. And maybe one way to do this is to have a moratorium on buying meals for the majlis and actually have everybody get, or let's say 5 people each time get there early, volunteer, and, you know, cook everything for the majlis together.
Yeah, that's not a bad thing.
Well, but who would volunteer?
They may have to be asked.
Maybe there should be a rotation.
Yes, there could be, and there could be enough communication that, you know, changes can be made. You know, that, in other words, ideally the group would know if they were short one, and someone would step up.
Yes, but it still needs to be organized. Who's coming? What will they do? What food will we have? Who's going to buy it? I mean, I see it as a management problem.
Oh, well.
And a lot of this we do it. So there are people who, I wouldn't say, some of them volunteer, but then some of them get asked to do. So it's a beautiful thing when they volunteer, because that makes it home. But we've done some of it in the retreat settings, and it has worked amazing, and it has built friendships outside.
Anyway, I think we all agree, and my feeling is if we get a group of fuqara together and sit around and talk about this, they'll all agree. But then the question is, what gets done and who does it and what are the details and the dynamics? And I don't mean to sound like those problems can't be solved.
Right.
But those are the issues.
Yeah, I mean, you have a good idea and you have agreement, but how do you do it? How do you make it happen? How do you keep it going? But, some of that you have to figure out along the way.
I think you need to figure out how to get people to want to be involved, because you can't really, from the top down, enforce it.
Not unless I turn myself into a great charismatic leader.
But, from the top down, you could try to instill, an attitude of service or love for the tariqa that get people
Right.
to want to serve in various ways, whether it's donating money or donating time or whatnot. I just think that a fundamental problem we have is that, okay, a few people come to the things on Sundays, but how many of those people then talk to one another outside of that group on Sunday? How many people show up to a majlis and talk or see other people from the majlis between then and the next majlis?
Yes, that's exactly what I was referring to. So, given the fact that...
Well, there has to be a reason to do this that's bigger than the tariqa. And in a certain sense, there's a beauty in service. And our tariqa has, tended, although not in principle, to have beauty be in art and craft and music and whatever, the arts. But there's a beauty of soul that we want to have and have a way to practice doing it.
That's oh so true.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, why should anybody sacrifice anything? Because it's good for you. So, and it demonstrates, mostly to yourself, I think, your commitment to a spiritual path, that you're willing to sacrifice for it. And, sacrifice doesn't mean you have to starve or you need to, whatever, be celibate. But there are opportunities in all kinds of, seemingly ordinary interactions where you can decide how to be in that situation based on what would be more beautiful or based on what might free you of yourself. And if you get closer to other people, you're probably going to find some people that annoy you to death and some people who demonstrate an aspect of beauty of the soul that you hadn't considered before.
Yes. One can hope that happens.
Yes. So, I'm just thinking, part of the fourth way for Gurdjieff and actually for Guy Finley is encountering the frictions that occur between people and, learning how to accept differences and how to not be impatient, and all kinds of things can come out of that.
You mean like the virtues?
Yeah. If you want to have warmth, you have to have some friction.
Yes, that's right. As I said before, I think we'll all agree to this. So is what you're saying, if we make this point clear enough and strongly enough, everybody will decide it is in their own self-best interest to offer service?
Well, yes, but also, expressing virtues there are lots of opportunities to do that. But the important thing is to have a purpose of doing that.
Tell me more about purpose.
Well, in other words, if you have a purpose, you don't necessarily know how to accomplish it, but you want to know and you'll try and you'll learn how to do it. What the fourth way would call essential to have an aim.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, exactly. You may not shoot the arrow straight, but you ought to at least be pointing at the target.
Yes, at least need to know be certain of your intention.
Yes.
Right. So how will we do this? How will we transform our order into one that has better service, in which the people who belong to it better themselves by serving others?
Aside from talking about it, I think it would be nice if we had service, what Sheikh al-Bashir just said, why we want to do service and the purpose behind service. Communicating that is one of the biggest things to do, whether we put that up online or in a mudakara perhaps or something that emphasizes the importance of service.
That's an idea. Another thing that might be useful, if you have, regular meetings then you can ask people, in doing what they do, especially with other people, what have they learned?
Mm-hmm. And even to host that sahba instead of Sheikh al-Bashir being the host, to be able to feel confident that they can and they should offer to host the sahba.
I would like that very much. I certainly have the feeling that I make things happen. I'd like to be included rather than to be on the point all the time. But maybe that's my job.
Yeah, one of the hardest things in the spiritual path, if it's, as stripped down as some are, is how to use it, how to use your desire for what the path offers in your daily life.
Well, here's another example. So I'm sure there are people in the tariqah who love writing and they read a lot of books. So one of the ways they could serve is by even writing their reflections on what they've written and sharing it with the rest of the community.
Yeah. Well, and one could also look at something that's like more mythological.
I'm sorry, Sidi, would you start that sentence again?
I'm not sure that sentence was going the right place.
But let's start a different one in that case.
One of the things that's good that Guy Finley, that I don't like to do, is he wants people to report, He gives an hour-long mudhakara, basically, and then he suggests, one or more things you might do in order to practice it or see it more clearly. And then in the online gatherings, people are encouraged to share what they've seen. It doesn't have to have come from the previous talk. It could be any insight you had. And of course,
share any insight you've had?
Yeah.
Maybe one thing that could be done is to have regular meetings, let's say twice a month. And I agree with you, Sheikh al-Bashir. You should not be taking all the responsibility for this, but maybe you could be the one to start. And maybe for, let's say, the first 6 sessions would be your thoughts on some book you particularly love, like the Ashtavakra Gita or something like that. And then once you've done that, then someone moves on to something else. Rather than just, like the chit-chat sessions of Sundays, make it more structured. Or even, if you were going to say to the thing with Sundays, the subhas, maybe have a theme and get people to, rather than talking about their day-to-day lives, talk about their journey, talk about their stories. That's important. Stories are important. That's how you get to know someone.
I think that's a good idea to have people talk about their stories.
Right, and if people are encouraged to share what they've learned, it usually comes with an event and there's a story to tell. It may be short or it may be long, but you're sharing the context in which you learned or saw something, not just speaking a few sentences or something. Yeah, I think there needs to be a means to express one's longing for the divine, and it does not have to be all bhaktic or anything. Whatever it is that brought you to the path, that's really the most important thing, unless you find you outgrow it.
Like to join us Sunday and share your story?
Well, I was thinking about, individual experiences.
You've got a story and it's got good parts. You have many stories.
Well, yeah, that's true. I mean, we could, I suppose, be a little bit like elders and reflect on some of our life experience.
Yes, exactly. I'd like to have everybody do that in this context now that Sayyidah Badriya has defined it so clearly. Yes, tell our stories. We have many stories to tell. This is how people know each other.
Yeah, and they don't have to be special stories or long stories or really interesting stories. You don't want to bore people to death, but
all I think we can ask the people is that the stories are important to them.
Yes, exactly.
They're sharing what's important to them.
That's right. And that's part of being visible and, sharing with others how you are, not just what you think.
Yes, not just what you think.
In my experience, when someone tells a story that's truly important to them and they present it in a manner with radical candor and with pure authenticity, it is never boring.
Yeah.
So maybe we should try it.
I think we should try it on our next soapbox. I think this is one of the things that we're looking for. And certainly one of the things that's helpful to service is recognizing people as fellow human beings and fellow travelers.
Yes.
You get to know that by hearing their stories.
Yeah, what's really essential is to realize that there's so much more the same between you and the other. And, well, yeah, that. You can discover that you're not so special that way, too.
Yes, thing to discover if you're up to it. All right, we've had enough time on that question.
Who is your favorite mystical poet?
One of my favorites was Kabir when I was in school days. And there was a class in my school, believe it or not, that used to go through Kabir's poetry.
Kabir is wonderful. I was thoroughly enjoying Kabir, and then all those Rumi books started coming out, and that was wonderful too. And then the Ashtavakra Gita, that came along to me, and, that pushed things even more wide open. But, some of that depends on translation too. But because I've read Hafiz in a standard older translation, and it seemed pretty flat, but, I've seen him from other sources, and he's really good.
Well, I have a real problem answering this question because I love so many poets who write about God and mystical vision. And I mean, everybody from Rumi to Emily Dickinson, from Hafiz to Rilke or Mary Oliver for that matter. As long as they have that sense of the transcendent. I wouldn't want to have to pick a favorite.
No, I couldn't pick a favorite. All I can do is mention the ones I think of that I know I like.
Do you have a favorite?
Yes, David Herbert Lawrence, without any doubt. His poetry, especially his late poetry, is just unbelievable. It communicates something to me, something beyond words.
I must say, I don't know his poetry really very well at all and would be happy to get to know it.
Okay. I can definitely introduce you to some of his deeper religious poetry sometime. The poem Ship of Death is just amazing, and many others dealing with the path and God and life and the practices. And aside from Lawrence, I would say my next two would be William Blake and Friedrich Hölderlin. Hölderlin has some good translators in English, but he's way better in German, just like Rilke. Rilke and Hölderlin have some good translators into English too. And Blake, he was something. One has to wonder if he, Blake was a prophet living in an age that was no longer the age of prophets. So he did his thing, and people ignored him for 100 years, and now they teach some of his shorter poems in elementary school. But if you get into Blake, he's also one of those other ones that really teaches you a lot if you're willing to spend the time with him. And when I talk about some of these people, Emily Bronte, Blake, Lawrence, Rilke, Hölderlin, it's not a matter of reading their books. It's not a matter of reading their books. It's a matter of them actually putting their soul into what they were writing, them putting a part of themselves there, and that part still lives with us. And when you commune with these texts, you are having lunch with them. You are having a meeting of hearts and minds. And that to me is everything.
Well, I'd be happy to widen my horizon here, but just send me a few poems. Say, Zainab, anything? We're still on the poem question.
A lot of poets, it's not so much poets that catch my attention, it's some poems that will really speak to me, moods that I'm in. So poetry is definitely a divine speech. It comes from a place of inspiration. that inspiration in the majority of the cases which I read is divine.
Well, it is the communication of the inspiration that.
Yes, yes. Well, poetry seems to be particularly good at that. You can probably do it in prose, but it's more complicated.
Well, yes, and your prose will start to sound poetic even if it wasn't intended.
I suppose that's true.
I actually just recently read a very strong defense of prose by David West, one of the translators of Virgil's Aeneid. And he said, right now in the 21st century, sometimes the best thing we can do is to have poetic prose, because poetry, common poetry, is so diminished by being turned into prose, essentially. And there's good prosy, like free verse poetry that's intensely poetic and wonderful, like Walt Whitman. But I do have to say I'm not a fan of like most contemporary poetry. On the other hand, there's a lot of good prose that's being written that's incredibly poetic. And we can, of course, mix it and match it there, but like it has to have that heart, and that's the thing.
But we're looking at it at the level of language, not at the level of its ability to deliver a message. Can you actually say that a poem is better than a great novel? Take Tolstoy or somebody like that, who writes about transcendent questions, but in the form of stories.
Right.
I don't think they can be compared because both are mediums of expression, and poetry suits some people. They're good at expressing their thoughts in a poem, and some others are good in expressing their thoughts in a storybook, for example.
Certainly that's true. And others in music.
In art, yes.
Others in film.
Film and dance.
Yes, Andrea?
Yes, and Lawrence, he was a master of them all. He wrote poetry, short stories, novels, philosophical essays, painted. My God, his paintings are sublime. And all of this is like, come here, I'm calling you out, I'm bringing you towards God. And then people ignore him except for one book of his, which, was completely misinterpreted, and people hung on to it because at the time he was using some 4-letter words in there. And, oh, look, there's some 4-letter words, let's ban this book. And it's ridiculous. But anyway, I think, whatever speaks to one. And novels, stories, poetry, plays, artwork, music, it's all good. And it's all art, unlike a lot of metaphysics. Some metaphysics is art too. Like if you read Plotinus, Plotinus, he wrote Sublime Metaphysics, but it was also a work of art. But we need to get away from the academic crap.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a place for it, but we need to recognize its limits and its point of view in most cases.
Well said. I agree completely. Useful, but needs to know its limits.
Right. Because you might get some knowledge from an academic presentation of something that you're able to vivify, that you find describes something that you hadn't been able to put your finger on in your own experience.
Yes, truly.
I mean,
to work out the details and demarcations of things that but can't be articulate about.
Yeah, sometimes, if you need to elaborate on something, somebody may help. But the spirit blows where it will.
And of course, there are some academic writings that are produced by academics because in the last century and a half, that's the only place these people would have fit in. But you see that these people aren't academics at heart, they're seekers at heart. But those are, let's say, the exception that proves the rule.
Well, exceptional things usually are an exception. You can't have popularity determine what's good.
Andrea, do you like Wallace Stevens?
Yes.
Okay, just testing. think about how we can implement some of these wonderful ideas about service.
Okay.
Yeah. Service and practice should overlap.
Yeah, of course.
Service is practice.
Yes, it is. That's the overlap. Yeah. Well, anyway.